Next, I want to ask everyone to please stay muted and turn off your video just during the presentation so that we can try to avoid frozen screens and the glitches that can come along with a lot of videos going at once. Many of you submitted specific questions when you registered, and most of those will be answered by Selena tonight during the presentation. If you have other questions, please use the chat box to type in your questions, and then Selena will answer them, as many of them as she can, during the Q&A session that follows the workshop. We are scheduled to end at 8:30 tonight, so if time runs out and we're not able to get to your question, you have a link to the Garden Hotline's website in the email that I sent you earlier today with the Zoom link, so you can ask your questions online or by phone to the Garden Hotline. Now we have just a couple yard-related questions that we'd like to ask you both at the beginning of this workshop and at the end of the Q&A session. This is just to help us understand the effectiveness of this workshop and what you're taking away from it. If you complete the questions, I will enter your name into a drawing for either a book about gardening or a 90-minute one-on-one online consultation with one of Tilth Alliance's gardening experts who can give you specific recommendations about your yard and garden. The two books that we're going to be giving away for tonight's workshop are, this one is Month by Month Gardening for the Pacific Northwest. It has tips for trees, shrubs, whatever you have in your yard for every month of the year, and it specifically has a lot of Washington content in here. I will not give you my display copy, it is mine, but I have a new copy that I will give to one lucky winner. The other book that we're going to give away is one I want to keep, but I can't. This is Gardening with Native Plants of the Pacific Northwest. This will become your garden Bible. So in fact, I think, Selena, if you don't mind, if you could put up the first poll right now, just so that everyone can answer the first set of questions while I do your introduction. Okay. And now I also want to let everyone know that we're going to start recording the workshop right about now. So without further delay, I'm excited to introduce tonight's speaker from Tilth Alliance. Selena Ligrano has a strong connection to plants and the environment. She has a Bachelor of Science in Wildlife Ecology and a minor in horticulture from Washington State University and an MBA in Sustainable Systems from Pinchot University. Selena loves working within the local food system, so after landscaping in our region for over a decade, she began volunteering in the Food Hub program at Tilth Alliance. Some of Selena's top priorities are to help bridge the gap in food access to our neighborhoods and to expand urban gardening and the farming community. For the past 5 years, she has run her own landscaping business with the goal of connecting her clients to their gardens and plants. Selena has transformed that business into a consulting company that focuses on community engagement and development and revitalizing the local food systems through edible gardens. If you attended any of our workshops last year, or even just last week's workshop, you've probably heard Selena and know that she's a wealth of experience and information. So thank you for joining us, Selena. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you to begin your presentation.
Awesome, thank you. Did you get the polls?
Give me just 1 second.
Okay. Let's see. Good. If a couple more people could answer, we're just a couple people short. That'd be lovely. Just give another couple of seconds so we can get another couple of people to answer the questions. And then I will share them with everybody. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and then I will share the results with everybody so you guys can just kind of see what we've got going on here with our group of people. And during this, I'm actually going to turn off my video just to make sure that I don't lose any sort of connectivity during this, because you just never know with all of the people that are doing all this stuff right now. Okay. Were you able to get all of the results?
I have exactly what I need. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so with that, I am going to get started. Thank you everybody for joining tonight. We're going to talk about putting your garden to bed. This can be a kind of a large topic, so we're going to run through some highlights and go into a little bit of more depth in some areas. And please, if you have any questions, put them in the chat box and I will answer them towards the end during the Q&A. And if I can't get to them, or if I need to get you more information, I can get your email and send out more information to you, or you're welcome to email the hotline too at the end. So just kind of a little highlight here. We're going to talk about healthy soil, how to look at building habitat in your yard, and then fall maintenance for some of the different types of plants you might have in your yard, and specifically looking at kind of encouraging wildlife diversity in the yard, because it is very important as we're looking at gardening and landscaping and designing our own yards. And then lastly, beneficials and pollinators, because they are an important part of the garden and also something important to think about when you are putting your garden to bed. So first, just some overall just understanding of what healthy soil is. I like to think of healthy soil as our immune system, and thinking about having healthy plants are really needed to be able to have that healthy soil. If we don't have healthy soil, then plants can sometimes be a little bit more sickly, and it's really just kind of the basis for having that overall good environment in your backyard. Soil really helps to reduce the amount of fertilizers and pesticides that are needed. It helps with irrigation needs, and by having the right type of soil, you know that your plants are either able to hold on to the moisture that they need, or it's allowing enough drainage that they need for the specific type of plant that you have. Healthy soil really helps to filter out urban pollutants. As Christy mentioned, it's very important that we also look at trying to sequester some of that storm water and filter out any sort of stuff that's coming through, slowing it down so it doesn't overflow our systems. And then lastly, looking at it as a storing site for carbon from the atmosphere. We have so much soil on the planet, and it is a great resource to be able to help hold that carbon and reducing the amount that goes up into our atmosphere. Soil is also there to really make and break plant success. So this is kind of when I'm talking about that immune system. It's really important to know what type of soil you have. And so whether or not you've ever really gotten your hands in the soil and tried to kind of figure that one out, think about whether or not you have sandy soil, or if you might have clay soil. It really can change the different ways that you garden and the different types of plants that you have. If you have a higher clay content, it's going to hold on to more moisture. You're going to have more nutrients that are going to be staying in that soil. It also can be very compact and very hard for some plants to grow into. If you have sandy soil, then you're going to have a lot more drainage that's going to be going out. And you also then can risk not having as much nutrients being held on into that soil. So really knowing what your soil is, get your hands out there, really pick it up and start moving it through your fingers and feeling how gritty it is will help you to understand a little bit more about what you have in your own backyard. It's really important to, if you have either extra sandy or extra clay soil, mixing in compost or mixing in some sort of amendment is a really great way to help build that soil and to increase that organic matter, which really helps to actually change the makeup of the soil. And then lastly, testing your soil. If you haven't already, highly recommend getting your soil tested. King Conservation District is a great resource for people within their service area. And there is a link at the very end of this spreadsheet or of this presentation. And then I believe Christy also has a link online for information from them on how to take your soil test, and then also where to send it to. The other reason that soil tests are very important and why we recommend getting them done in the fall is because it is towards the end of the year. So the plants have kind of soaked up a lot of the nutrients, and it's also a great time to add different amendments or mulches or different products into your soil because sometimes they can take 2 or 3 months to actually work in and become available to plants. So fall is a great time to figure out what you need to add, adding that material, and then by spring, it'll become available and your soil will be ready to go. Whoop. We're gonna just go all over the place tonight. Okay, so one of the things that I mentioned that can be added is mulch. So some of the benefits of mulch is that it really helps to conserve moisture. And this is because it helps add organic matter. It helps to kind of create like a little blanket on the top that helps with any sort of transpiration from the sun. It helps to keep weeds out. If you have a good 2 or 3 inch layer of mulch, it helps to suppress those weeds by blocking out that light. And some people don't realize, but it actually helps to moderate the soil temperature. So in the summertime, it helps to not have it so hot because it has like a little blanket. And then in the wintertime, it helps to keep it a little bit warmer because of that extra insulation layer. It helps with compaction from the rains that come through by spreading out that water so it's not hitting one spot and it's more trickling down through before it gets to the soil. Always think about potted plants too. It's not just for your veggie beds or your perennial beds or tree-like areas. Potted plants can benefit from mulch also. Light mulch versus dark mulch. A lot of times the dark mulch will help to absorb some heat, and so sometimes it can be really good in a veggie garden. And then leaves are really important, and you should be keeping those around your yard. It's nice to rake them up off the grass, but keeping those in and around your shrub beds or in your trees, or even adding on top of your veggie beds can actually be a really huge benefit over time. And then also just thinking about mulch, it is also a spot for different types of habitat. So a lot of times there's different insects, there's different ground bugs and beetles that live under little layers of mulch, which are creating those habitats for the insects that might eat bad bugs. It's also a food source for different birds as they're going through the winter time. So some of the different types of mulch. So there's many different types. Oftentimes we think about them for specific areas. Wood chips is probably the most common that people see, and oftentimes we recommend these for perennials, shrub and tree beds, around different types of ground covers, and then also for pathways. And part of that is that they take longer to break down, and so they can kind of hold those areas a little bit longer. Compost is really great for vegetable gardens and your annual beds. It has a little bit more nutrients in it. It breaks down much faster, so it can be worked into that soil much quicker than something like different types of woody products like the wood chips. Leaves are great for everywhere, and definitely recommend now is a great time to go and start collecting a lot of those as we are fully into fall. And being able to work those in, they break down over time, and it's a great way to be able to kind of have a free compost or a free mulch to be able to add into your garden. There's different types of commercial mixes, oftentimes different manure products such as steer, horse, or chicken, and then different types of wood products that are mixed together, and you can often find in most either hardware stores or plant centers in different bags, which can be easier for some people to be able to bring home. Burlap is an excellent resource from, say, coffee bags, and using those as a protective way to protect that soil. And it's oftentimes used on vegetable beds or just open areas that maybe you aren't quite ready to plant in yet. And then sheet mulching is a technique that is kind of a layering system, and I'll go a little bit more into that in the next slide. But it's a great way if you want to convert either a lawn into a new bed, or if you have a spot that's just extra weedy that you just need to kind of have some control over. And then lastly, cover crops. And this is oftentimes you see in veggie beds and sometimes in containers. And I'll go into more depth about cover crops later, but they're excellent for helping to build soil and protecting it through the winter time. So sheet mulching, as I mentioned, is a technique that we use oftentimes for converting different areas. So it can also be called lasagna layering or lasagna gardening. And generally what people do is you take cardboard or multiple layers of newspaper and you lay it on an area that is either grass or an area that is just a troublesome weedy area. And then you put either compost or soil down a couple of inches, and then you would put a couple of inches of either wood chips or arborist chips on top. It's a great way to do this in the fall, and then by spring, in about like 6 months or so, it actually kills off and breaks down that material underneath. And the cardboard or the newspaper breaks down enough that you can actually get a shovel or something through if you want to end up planting in the springtime for a new area. So it's a great way. It helps to help build that soil underneath. You don't have to remove the grass, so it's a lot easier than having to remove soil. Because if you do remove that grass, it can actually, you're removing some good top layers of soil that's in there. So it's a great way to keep that material there, add organic matter by increasing habitat for worms or different beneficial insects. And then if you want, you can always add different layers of burlap on top to help just kind of add like a whole nother layer on top of everything to just protect it through the winter time. So cover crops. So this is a really common thing that we suggest people to put in pretty much now. It's something that you would be putting in October through middle, like probably beginning of November. It's really has a multiple different benefits. One of the first things is that it protects the soil from our winter rains. Our rains oftentimes can leach a lot of different nutrients out, and it can really impact the nutrients that are left in the soil for our vegetable crops, especially after them being planted and sucking a lot of that nutrients out throughout the year. It helps to prevent soil compaction because, as you can see in these two pictures, it's a pretty thick carpet of plants. And so what happens is the water, instead of just going down and hitting the soil over and over and over again, really compacting and making it really tough to plant in, it helps to kind of distribute that water droplets, and so they kind of bounce around while they go down. It adds nitrogen to the soil, and that's some of the different types of options that you have for cover crops can actually fix nitrogen for the soil. It helps by giving more space and more habitat for different types of microorganisms that are working together with the root system, and then also with just that added organic matter. In the springtime, the organic matter is mixed back into the soil. So it's just another way to be able to kind of keep that product right on site. Because you are planting it so thickly, it helps to keep a lot of different weeds at bay. Some weeds are also not able to grow within some of these different types of crops. So it's a great way to just, if you don't kind of like have a fall crop that you're planting, putting in some of the cover crops is a great just kind of alternative than just leaving it bare open soil. And it's referred to oftentimes as green manures. And that's just because it's a living type of a crop that's there, and then it kind of becomes a vegetable manure, I guess is the way that you could call it. And they fall into two different categories, which I'll go into a little bit more: the annual grasses and then also the legumes. And so first, looking at the grasses. So these are annual grasses. So they are different from our perennial grasses that you would see around. So the common ones that we plant in the Northwest are rye, barley, oats, and then also winter wheat, which can also be a commercial crop for some farmers too. So the reasons we like the grasses is that they produce really dense growth. And as you can see, that root system there, it's a pretty intense, dense root system. So it really helps to break up tough clay soil and helps to kind of bring sandy soils back together as the root system breaks down. It produces a lot of organic matter in that it can get 3 to 4 feet tall. And so it's a great way to then, when you cut that down in the springtime, using that as another type of a mulch on the top of the soil. With the legumes, so the top the purple flowered picture is vetch, which is a common type of one that we have. Fava beans. Crimson clover is the bottom picture with the little pink flower, and then Austrian field peas. Now, these are our annual crops. These are not the perennials that you find in your garden. So the only times that we worry about these actually having a problem in the garden is if you let them go to seed. So they're not going to come back every year unless you've let them go too far. And that's same with the cereal grains, grasses too. So that's why these are often used as cover crops. These legumes have the ability to actually fix nitrogen. So they're able to take the nitrogen from the air, and then they have little nodules on their roots that then turns it into a source of nitrogen that crops can actually uptake. And so in the springtime, you cut them down and you mix them into the ground, and it helps to release that nitrogen for the different types of plants the following year. And then they also have very deep root systems, so they also help contribute to releasing and fixing that compacted soil. The other things we really like about these guys is that they are really good for beneficial insects. So I don't know if you can see it, but on the clover in the bottom picture, there is a little honeybee eating some of the nectar on there. So it's another really great one to have. You can find these crops in most of your plant nursery stores, and online for sure. They're available in a lot of different places. So next, thing about habitat. So as you can kind of see there, I kind of talked a little bit about how some of these cover crops are also creating spaces and places for different types of habitat for beneficial insects or other types of animals. So a habitat is a natural home or environment of an animal, plant, or other organism. It's a particular type of environment that regarded as a home for organisms. And so we like to think about our gardens as habitats for not only us to go and hang out and being able to enjoy, but also the numerous different bugs, insects, worms, spiders, squirrels, birds, any of that sort of stuff. They're all around. They all work together, and so it's important to create a place for all of them. So some of the different ways that you can build habitat. And so some of the different things to think about when you're planting or creating a space in your backyard is diversity. So diversity in not only the different colors or types of plants, but also in the shapes and sizes and species. So making sure that you have stuff that has year-round interest, not being overly tidy. And so allowing some stuff to have some little bits of stems left over or seed heads. Having a little couple of spots where there's bare ground for the different ground nesters, and also having spaces for stuff like our mason bees who actually need some of that dirt to be able to pack into their tubes. Moss for birds to be able to have for their nests. Different types of plants are important for different stages of animals. So different plants are necessary for the larval stage of animals, such as milkweed. So milkweed is very important for our monarch butterflies, and that is their main food source at that stage. Having some dense areas so that animals have a safe place to live, and then also thinking about different types of alternate habitats. So you can see this big rock pile, which I'm not saying put a big rock pile in your backyard, but just recognizing that those are also spaces and habitats for different types of animals. So just thinking about those different ways to incorporate those into your yard. You don't have to work them all in, but just thinking about that as you're cleaning up or as you're moving stuff around, the different types of animals that might find a special place to be able to live in those places. And then lastly, water. It is important for all different types of animals, especially through winter time and in the middle of our summers when we have our droughts and stuff, puddles start to dry up. So why are we gardening to attract wildlife? So not only is it important for preserving habitat for the different animals just to have around, but they also increase the amounts of beneficial insects we have. They add health and beauty to your own garden, and they also make it a little bit easier for some maintenance sometimes because you are having all of these other types of animals that are helping to eat some of the bad bugs that you might have around. So if you're encouraging different birds or mammals that are eating some of what we would call pests, then you're reducing the amount of work that you have to do in your own backyard. So here's some examples of some different habitats that and the types of animals that like to live in them. So the first one is of a snake. So a lot of times people don't think of snakes as being a good thing to have, but they're actually really important for slugs, for slug control. And they need a warm spot to rest on, and then also some grassy or kind of covered areas to kind of slither away in. Lady beetles lay their eggs in different types of spots where aphids are present, but they also need different textures and different types of grasses or different types of stems to be able to lay those eggs and then have their larval and pupal stages on them. And you can see at the bottom, bug hotels is a way you can create your own kind of habitat for them. And then bumblebees are actually nest dwellers in the ground. So it's important just to think about that, is that they're not making a nest, say like a honeybee or a wasp, they're actually burrowing in the ground. So being aware of that as you're gardening and tending to your garden. So the main, what we call the key successes. So you need to have food, shelter, nesting places, and water. So in looking at food, oftentimes we think about native plants because they are what our native animals are most used to. So they know that their nectar, fruit, or seeds and what they can eat and what time of year they're going to be around. So it is a lot easier for them. Over the years, some of the plants that we have had and moved in are not necessarily native plants, but they've been around long enough that some of our native animals are starting to recognize them more. And so they're able to use them in a similar way. They also know what is going to be their kind of insect prey that they want to get on. So they know what is more likely to be on that food or on that plant. And then also lastly, native plants are great just because they're used to our climate. So they are used to our wet winters and our dry summers. And they also allow us to not have to worry so much about watering. And if we put them in the right place, not having to prune them as often because they are made for the space that they're being put into. Plants offer multiple different types of food sources. So whether or not that's a nectar or a fruit, it can also be a seed of some sort. And so when thinking about you're kind of creating this space for the different types of animals that you have, thinking about leaving some seed heads every once in a while, because those seed heads are actually very important for different types of birds in the fall. And a lot of the different flowers at all different times of the year are important for all the different types of insects that we have around our area. So shelter is very important, and specifically having stuff that we call a hedgerow style. And so this is thinking about different canopy layers. So mimicking a forest edge. So where you have the tallest canopy trees, and then you have your mid layer of your shrubs, and then maybe a perennial kind of shorter layer, and then down at the very bottom, the ground covers, and then some sort of leaves or bark or whatever material is kind of fallen on the ground. Having these different layers offers nesting sites. It offers areas for different shelter. It also, by adding a mix of evergreen and deciduous, you have year-round interest for your own self too. And so it's really important to kind of think about that when you're creating this space, is all of the different ways that these are all interacting together for not only for you, but also for the different types of animals that we have around. So here's an example of a hedgerow that has a lot of different stuff going on. Not that you need to put this much in there. This is a pretty extensive garden that I would say would be a lot of work to maintain just because of how much is going on. But looking at the different heights and the diversity of evergreen trees like the cedar tree, you have a Japanese maple, you have hydrangeas, there's ferns, there's a little bit of everything. And so it's nice to just have that diversity. There's always something happening in that yard. And if you were to go and just sit and kind of be quiet, I bet you would have multiple different types of birds. You would have different types of butterflies, or all different kind of animals kind of working together in that space. So thinking about nesting sites, so oftentimes, like I said, you can have spaces that you have the different heights. Some animals need really dense areas. Some need more open canopies to put a nest directly on top. I have a squirrel nest in my Japanese maple in front of my yard, and they like to hide in the top of the tree. Whereas we have a flicker nest that is actually formed in the top of the power pole right outside. And then you can have like little tiny birds that'll make a nest on the ground or in my hanging basket, which has happened also this year. So I've created all different types of habitats without even trying. And so it's nice to have that diversity for those animals because they've helped to keep the bugs away in my house. So looking at pruning, not doing too much, especially during the nesting seasons. You can add different types of nesting boxes for different animals, depending on what you have. And then also leaving those wood chips or other things for the different insects that they have actually a food source. And then also for those animals that are overwintering, our different insects, our beetles are really important for that, and a lot of our different bees. And then some of our different solitary bees, which I'll go into a little bit more later on, actually are nesting in hollow stems of either stuff like bamboo or even the sedum types of stems that kind of hollow out. Those are another great one to leave. Here's an example of some moss and some kind of little bits of cotton that a bird found and created a little nest on the ground. So some of the things that's kind of interesting with thinking about nesting needs, here's a list of some of the different bees, beetles that are common and the types of spaces that they'll end up like kind of creating their own nest. So bumblebees, rodent holes, open ground, upside down flower pots, and wood piles. Bumblebees are very important also because they are one of our main pollinators for tomatoes. So good thing to have around your yard. Carpenter bees like softwood and stems with pith such as blackberries. And they are going to be also the ones that are making, you'll see kind of digging into some of the wood spots. Leaf cutter bees, they like to find little spots that are tubes also, and they're actually the ones you're going to see if you ever have a leaf, like an evergreen leaf, and it looks like someone took a hole punch out of the side of it. It's very likely that's a leaf cutter bee. So they're not ever going to kill that leaf. They use that leaf to pack into their nest and put a space in between each egg that they lay. Mason bees, probably one of the more common ones that people know about. They find any sort of kind of tunnel, dead wood, or even human-made houses, which I'll show later on too, where there are different types of tubes. And mason bees are one of our very important pollinators because they are the first ones that actually come out in the springtime and do a lot of really good work for our different fruit trees that we have around. Sweet bees, they need the bare compacted soil. Different beetles really need the different ground cover, leaf litter, different types of bark and stuff like that. And then birds are all over the gambit. They need tree canopy, they need stuff on the ground, they need a little bit of everything depending on what type of bird they are. And then moths and butterflies are oftentimes in our shrubs and also our different types of grasses. So here's an example of a leaf cutter bee, and you can see he's got a little tiny piece of leaf that he's sticking into that hole. So they all have very diverse types of needs. Everything from the bare ground, rotting wood, burrows, hollow stems, rock, grass tufts, and then these little manufactured homes like this. So it's important to be able to keep some of those and add them into your garden to help with encouraging those different types of animals to be in your garden. So here's kind of a fun project for kids or even just for yourself as adults, making insect hotels. And so this is taking different types of materials that might be a benefit to not only different bees and bugs, but also stuff like beetles that can all find their own little space in there. So you can get different size logs and twigs, leaves, tubes, and just a little bit of everything to be able to fit in. And then mason bee houses you can buy and install on the side of your houses. And it's a great way to be able to encourage that diversity in your garden. So I mentioned not being too tidy. So this is something that I think oftentimes is hard for people to not want to cut everything down and just fully prepare for the winter. And so part of what's important with this is having a little bit of tolerance of that, what might seem a little bit messy. So cutting down stuff that maybe is going to be falling into a pathway or is overtaking another plant, but recognizing that seed heads are oftentimes really important for different animals late in the season. Anything that has a little bit of fluff on it is going to be important for nesting. And then also having some dead leaves on the ground to help with kind of having a way for some of those animals to be able to kind of tuck away and hide in the wintertime. And those dead leaves are also that free mulch that you're getting by adding into the garden. And it does break down over time, so it's going to be contributing to that soil health too. So having a little bit of tolerance, recognizing those spaces where those habitats might be, and just kind of cutting back minimally what you're doing and leaving some of those spaces intentionally. So leaving the natural area. So as you can see here, those some of the seed heads from the black-eyed Susan, the rudbeckia. These are very important for goldfinches in the fall time. And then you can see the Japanese anemone on the side here. And those hummingbirds are actually using those and gathering that fluff to be able to line their nests. So like I said, it's really important. And once you've kind of seen some of those seed heads that are maybe kind of completely fallen apart, if they're starting to get a little bit far gone, then it's a great time to cut them back, but leaving them and giving that time for some of those animals to be able to utilize that is really important, especially as we're creating these new landscapes in our areas that we have taken away some of their habitat. So being able to provide something back to them, we not only get the joy of having them there and helping to be able to see them and experience them, but we're also contributing to that habitat at the same time. So water is very important for all different animals, not only for just giving themselves a bath, but they're also drinking it. It's super, super important for different insects and bats. And a lot of times people don't realize that these animals are flying through the sky, and they're kind of, sometimes sprinklers are really helpful for certain types of animals because they actually drink on the fly and they're not going to stop and drink the water so much. So when you do have sprinklers going, sometimes there's insects or other animals that are going through. You don't necessarily have to have a bird bath. It could be a little cup of water in a corner of your yard, and it could be a water feature that you have too. But you'll see if you have different types of water, butterflies and other types of insects like that are going to sit in a calm spot, where some other animals might like a little bit more of a rushing type of water to be able to use. So planting in the fall, this is one of the best times to plant, and a lot of times it's because of those cooler temperatures. So it is less stressful on plants when you're planting this time of the year, because you don't have the sun and the heat that is pulling all of the moisture out of their leaves. Oftentimes plants kind of shut down when it's super hot out. And so this is a time when they're more likely to be able to just kind of relax a little bit. It's a great time for us to get out and plant because it's not so hot for us too, and we can relax when we're planting. Those roots really do a lot more development when it is a little bit cooler outside. So it's a lot of times when you see perennials and trees are being planted a lot more often this time of the year because of those more extensive root systems that you have going in. It also helps because you don't have to water as much as we start to have our rainy season come in. And it's another great time because you can actually see more of the bones of your garden as some of the stuff starts, the leaves start falling off. You can start to see what maybe has gotten extra big or what you might need to cut back on, divide, or where you might have a spot that maybe needs a little bit more, something else added to it in the end. So planting choices. There is a whole bunch of different types of stuff out there. Right now, I would say shrubs, trees, spring bulbs are all going to be the best things to plant right now, cover crops. And then also garlic. This is the time that you are planting garlic. And we're kind of running out of time for any sort of other edible plants. We just don't have quite enough time for them to get established before going into winter. Once again, native plants are really great because of their pest and disease resistance. Thinking about grouping plants together. So this is kind of going into a little bit more of kind of design when you're thinking about planting, but you don't want to plant something like a blueberry that needs a whole bunch of water with something like a rosemary that needs a lot drier conditions. They're going to be fighting each other. You're going to be fighting them, and one's going to get overwatered and one's going to get underwatered. So making sure you're planting and grouping plants with their needs, whether that's sun or water and even nutrients, is really important. Thinking about seasonal planting. So what is going to be blooming in the spring, summer, fall, and even potentially winter. You not only have something to look at through all those times of the year, you also have something that will be for all of the different wildlife that you have in your garden throughout the entire time of the year. It's fun to be able to intermix edibles. So oftentimes I like to plant something like kale or blueberries or currants in with my different perennials or my different shrubs. They oftentimes are beautiful plants and people see them as just being planted in an edible garden, but they actually work really well with a lot of the different types of plants that you have out there. And as kind of like a starting off point, I think of like rosemary, lavender, and sage are really easy plants that can kind of go in an ornamental, non-edible garden and also an edible garden. So it's a great way to kind of begin that transition between the two. And then those cover crops. So the Phacelia on the bottom is actually a cover crop that is put in the springtime rather than in the fall. And it's a summer blooming cover crop that actually does add nitrogen back into the soil also. So letting them go, letting them bloom, just making sure you're cutting those cover crops back before they go to seed or they will start to take over your garden. So it's just the one thing to think about with those is those ones we do tend to cut sooner than some of the other plants, but you still want to have them bloom for the nectar that the animals are needing. So here's just a short list of some of the super, super important types of plants that we have for attracting pollinators, and then also our beneficial insects or our predators of the common pest insects that we have. So there's three main families: the carrot family or the Apiaceae family. So these are examples of plants that have kind of more along the lines of that kind of umbrella type bloom. So at the very top there, lovage, cilantro, parsley, dill, angelica, Queen Anne's lace, sea holly, cilantro is another really common one in that. Fennel is also in that family. So these are all ones that oftentimes if I have carrots or cilantro, I actually let them go to seed after I've gotten the harvesting of the leaves or the root that I want. Let them go to seed, at least a couple of them. They're super, super important for insects such as the our parasitoid wasp, which is actually one of the best types of predators to be able to attack the different caterpillars that we have. And then you have the mint family. And so this is also the Lamiaceae family. So mint, lavender, thyme, oregano, sage, monarda, lemon balm, Russian sage, and rosemary. These are all in that mint family. So they tend to have that kind of more, a lot of times, a longer stick or like a longer panicle type of flower. They're super important for butterflies, many of the different bees and moths that are out there. And then you have the daisy family. And so this is the Asteraceae family. So anything that has that kind of daisy or sunflower look. So daisies, echinacea, rudbeckia, cosmos, yarrow, aster, echinops, and marigolds are some of the more common ones. And these guys are, I would say, good for almost all guys. I definitely see a lot of bees and butterflies on them. The other thing I should mention with the mint family is that sometimes you will see hummingbirds on these guys because they can have the little mini tubular flowers that they really like. So these are all really important to add into your gardens and to incorporate into any type of garden you have, because they are really helping to pollinate anything that needs to have a fruit. They're also helping to attract those different predator insects that are going to be eating stuff like the aphids or some of the different mites that you might have. They're also going to be eating the different larvae like the cabbage butterfly larvae that we have. So all of these are really important to attract those different types of insects so that we can kind of keep those different populations in check. So it's just kind of something that I think is a little interesting when looking at the different types of pollinator flowers, is also looking at the colors that are also common. So bees oftentimes look at yellow, blue, and purple types of flowers. So some examples of those are marigolds, daisies, and bee balm or monarda. Butterflies, red, orange, yellow, pink, and blue. So stuff like calendula and yarrow. These aren't only the types of flowers. These are just some of the more ones that their preference or what they commonly are attracted to. So moths like light colored flowers and things that open towards dusk. So evening primrose is an example for that. I've also seen them on many other different types of flowers, but it's just kind of interesting to think about what their preferences are. Hummingbirds, red, orange, purple, and then the tubular types of flowers. So fuchsias, nasturtiums, and even sage. So anything that has that long, skinny type of flower, which oftentimes you might also see some of the bumblebees go into those too, because they actually have a very long little tongue, not really a tongue, but kind of a tongue that goes in. So they like some of those longer tubular flowers also. And then bats like larger, light colored, night blooming flowers. An example is the cactuses. I've also seen them on some of the other like night blooming jasmine or something like that too. So just some examples of some other types out there and having that diversity, why it's so important. Oh, there you go. And it's kind of fun, this picture on the side here has an example of just how many different types of flowers you can put into one space with the different colors and the different types of plant families. So you're attracting a whole bunch of different types of animals. So thinking, going a little step farther, so moving away from not only just the couple of different types of animals that we think of as our beneficial or pollinator, we're also looking at some of the other types of organisms that help us. So there's different bacterias and funguses and viral types of activity. There's different parasitoid and parasitic different types of organisms that are out there in nature, and these are all working together to be able to create a full-on habitat. So having that diversity to be able to attract different types of things, knowing the life cycles of the organisms so that you know when and what is trying to target those specific ones, knowing what the prey and the predators are, and so that you know that there's food sources for those different animals, and then when you're bringing the different animals in or when you're trying to control them. So here on the bottom we have the baby, the larval stage of the ladybug. So there is the adult ladybug on the top, and then its larval stage on the bottom. And the larval stage is actually the one that's doing more of the damage on controlling aphids and other types of insects, more so than the adult. So knowing that is really helpful in making sure you're, first off, not killing the little guy that looks like a crazy little alligator, but also knowing that when you're bringing in adult insects or adult ladybugs, knowing that they're not going to be doing as much of the work as their young are. So making sure that they're going to lay those eggs and stay there for a while. So making sure they have another food source like nectar, water source, habitat, so they can continue those populations. And then the next little picture is just examples of some bat houses on the edge of some fields so that they're attracting the bats to help eat some of the insects that might be in the fields. Just some more examples of some of the other what we call garden heroes out there. So hummingbirds are really great for pollination that you don't realize, and they actually are also eating a lot of different insects too. So when they're not eating the nectar and going after that, they're also eating a lot of different insects. The parasitoid wasps are extra, extra tiny. They're about the size of a tip of a pencil, and they actually lay their eggs inside of aphids and also in different caterpillars, and then they actually kill them from the inside out of that. So they're a great resource to have around. They don't sting, and they're super tiny. Ground beetles eat slugs and also different snails. And then the bush tit, which is a type of a little bird, are eating all different types of insects throughout the yard. Mud daubers are a wasp that are solitary, and although they look very scary, they're actually eating nectar and spiders, and they will not come after you unless you really try to do something to them. So it's another one of those good guys to have around your yard. And then the famous lady beetle and the larva, and just how crazy it is, the different life stages that these insects can go through. So garter snakes eat slugs. So this is kind of one of those things we love to have these guys around. They would be very happy this year because of all of the slugs that we had this spring. So I wonder if there is an uptick in garter snakes now. The different birds, like I said, they are eating insects when they're young, and then these guys are eating weed seeds when they're older. So going back and forth, knowing the different life stages and knowing what each one is specifically going after. Bats can eat anywhere from 600 to 1,000 insects an hour, and they only have one baby a year. But they do a huge amount of damage on the different insect populations, so they're great to have around. And having those blooms for them to be able to also get that nectar is super, super important. So some of the benefits of native bees, I mentioned earlier that they are some of the earliest in this season to show up, specifically for our fruit trees and the mason bees. They are kind of more of the workhorse than the honeybees, so they're there earlier in the day and later at night. They do better in our cooler and cloudier weather, and so they're actually the ones that are going to be doing a lot more of that pollination than the honeybees are. There is a lot of competition on flowers, so it can cause them to move, and the honeybees to move more frequently, which can be really beneficial for plants that have flowers on multiple different plants or multiple different flowers on one stem that need to cross-pollinate. Having that diversity is just super important in general, because if we lose one whole entire species, then we're unable to be able to make up that difference down the road. So putting in bee habitat, whether that's different crops or different bee houses or different flowers, just making sure you're putting that in there and helping with that. Here's just a small sampling of some of our native bees. In Western North America, there is over 30 different species of just bumblebees alone. Some of the examples of solitary bees are our mason bee, the leafcutter, and the carpenter bee. And then the green bees and our small bees or the sweet bees are ground nesting or semi-social. And so these are kind of just some examples of the different ones that we have out there. And you can see the leafcutter bee on the bottom left doing its work, cutting that little notch out of the leaf to line its tube. Some of the different butterflies and moths. And so we don't think about or realize how important they are for pollination, but they are both very important. And so here's a monarch and the milkweed flower, and a swallowtail larva are a big one for eating some of the different types of weed crops. The western sheep moth is a really big pollinator. And then you have the Taylor's checker spot on the bottom. These are just a couple of the different options that are out there. I really recommend you go out and just kind of take a moment to just be present in your garden and see what you can see, what types of bees, what types of moths and different insects you can see on your garden and the different flowers, to take note of what is attracting what, and what is the plant that maybe isn't doing so well, and trying to attract and bring some of those back to your garden. So just a little information about moths, because this is something that I think is oftentimes confusing for people, as they usually think of moths as being, they usually get a negative connotation to them. There's over 1,200 different species of moths in just the Pacific Northwest. Their wingspans range from 1/10 of 1 inch to 6 inches, depending on which one you have around. They're generally more active at night. They have their feathered or thread-like antennas. And so you can kind of see on these two pictures, their antennae are a little bit more fuzzy. Their wings are held horizontally or hugged around them. They make silk cocoons. If they're more colorful, then they tend to be a little bit more often seen during the daytime versus at night, like some of the more lighter colored ones. The sand verbena, the one at the top there, is at risk, and so it's important to kind of keep an eye out for those guys. And a lot of times these are due to habitat loss, which is why it's so important to be able to add that space into your own yard. And then when looking at butterflies, so these guys, they have little knobs on the ends of their antenna, and you can see in these pictures it much clearer than the feathers on the moths. They hold their wings up over their body, especially when warming up. So if you've ever seen them trying to get warm, they usually have them upright and then kind of open them to kind of warm themselves. They actually need a much warmer temperature to fly, around 60 degrees. They are usually out and about from March until early October. Their colorful wings are there for attracting a mate and then also for camouflage. They can be plant species dependent. So think of the monarch butterfly being very important to the milkweed, the red admiral and the stinging nettle, and then the Puget blue and the lupin. And just like the moths, they are at risk due to the urbanization and habitat loss. One of the butterflies that gets a bad rap and is actually called a moth, even though it is a butterfly, is the imported cabbage butterfly. So the little white, what we call usually a moth, is actually a butterfly that flies around your vegetable garden and has the green worm that is then eating your brassicas, such as your kale or Brussels sprouts or collard greens, is actually a butterfly. But somebody over the years decided it was a moth because moths generally get a bad name. So it's important to know what those species are and to be able to recognize the difference between those two. And then lastly, just a couple more of the beneficial insects out there and the different life stages so you can actually see and know what is in your garden. So the green lacewing is a super, super important one that we have out there. And you can see the very top picture is this little tiny dangle egg on the end of a little tiny strip. And that is a way that they lay their eggs so that they're less likely to get damaged by something. So they kind of blow in the wind. And then they actually turn into this kind of like alligator-like thing that are called aphid lions, apparently, but they eat aphids. Probably is one of their biggest ones that they eat. And so they're super, super important to have. And then you can see the adult on the far right-hand side is that lime green insect with the clear lacewing wings. The lady beetle or the ladybugs, you can see the little tiny yellow eggs on the far left, and then the different life stages when you go to the larva, to the pupa, and then to the adult. They're all stages are eating the different larvae, or I'm sorry, the aphids, but probably the larval stage is one of the largest ones that you'll see kind of running around. And then the bottom is just what we call an assassin bug. You can see the different eggs on the bottom and how different they are from the lacewing versus the lady beetle. And then how kind of terrifying they look as they get through their different stages. But they actually hide and jump out to eat different types of bugs. And so they're a really great one to also have in your garden. And I encourage you to go out and see if you can find the different life stages of any of these and the different types of insects that you might have out there. And so with that, just a handful of resources. You could reach us at the phone number on there. You can email us at help@gardenhotline.org. Tilth Alliance, Cascade Water Alliance, Puget Sound starts here, and then the City of Bothell page where Christy has a whole bunch of different resources for us. And then lastly, just if you have not already, we will be having our last class next Wednesday from 7 to 8:30, which will be on fall yard maintenance. With that, thank you very much, and I would like to open it up to questions. I'm going to stop sharing.
Yes, thank you very much, Selena. I know you had a lot of information to cover.
Yeah.
Just a reminder to everyone, we will post a recording of this workshop as well as a PDF of all the slides from tonight on our website, and I will send that link out to everyone. You should have it probably by noon on Friday. So we are ready to begin the Q&A session. We are scheduled again until 8:30. So if you haven't already had a chance, please type your questions now. I know we have already had a lot of questions typed in the chat box, so I'm going to try to group those. We have a lot of questions about mulch and a lot of questions about cover crop, and then we'll get to the other ones as we can. You can turn your video back on if you want or leave it off. We ask that you do please stay muted unless we need to ask you a follow-up question about your question. And like Selena said, if we don't get to everything, you can always submit your questions to the garden hotline. So let's begin. I'm going to start with questions about mulch. Some of these you may have covered already, but as I'm, furiously writing, I might have
No, of
missed it.
course.
So, first question, if someone has pink jasmine, do they need to put mulch around it for the upcoming fall and winter?
I would put mulch around almost anything if you have bare soil anywhere. Put some type of mulch down. So that would be for the jasmine too. With anything that you're putting mulch around, you don't want to cover the stems or the trunks because that can cause rotting. So leave about an inch or two away from that base. And that's probably going to be, I think the best is just pretty much everything you're going to want to put some sort of mulch down.
Okay, and if someone mulched in the spring or the summer, but it hasn't fully broken down, when should they mulch again?
I would just kind of scrape back a little bit. If you see maybe less than an inch of mulch, then I would maybe put a little bit more on. We usually say in a area where you have a whole bunch of plants, so like maybe a shrub bed or a perennial bed, 1 to 2 inches of mulch is pretty good. If you have a larger area like with shrubs or trees where there's a little bit more bare spots in between, doing 2 to 3 inches or even 4 inches, because those areas are going to, you don't have to go back as often and they're more of what kind of like a woody type of an environment, like a woodland. You can put a little bit more mulch on those spaces. So yeah, if it looks like it's breaking down, but it's still, you can still see about an inch or so, I think you're good. So just kind of keep an eye on it. Different products are going to break down at different times.
Okay, a couple questions about leaves as mulch. Someone's asking, isn't it important to remove leaves that might have diseases before you use them as mulch cover?
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, any sort of diseased plant material or leaves you want to remove from your garden. It's best to also put any sort of fungal type stuff or real disease stuff in the city yard waste to go away. Your home compost can't get hot enough oftentimes to kill any sort of bacteria or fungal spores. So it's best to just fully remove that out of your yard so that you're not contributing to it coming back potentially next year and causing spreading or other problems. So yes, good question.
What about different types of leaves to use for mulch? Are all leaves a good type? For instance, this person has cottonwood leaves. Do those make good mulch?
Yeah, so the types of leaves that we would say you might want to stay away from or do something else with would be some of the really extra leathery type leaves. So like rhododendrons are one that just comes to mind. Laurels, their leaves are so leathery that it takes a very, very long time for them to break down. So with something like that, you might not want to use, or if you can, shred them. So what I would tell people sometimes is stuff that has really leathery leaves, put them on your lawn and run your lawnmower over it. And that'll be a quick, easy way to shred them up, and then you can use them. There's some mulches, like wood type mulches, like black walnut and locust, that we don't recommend using in your gardens because they can actually inhibit germination. So those as wood products you would not want to use. But as far as leaves go, I don't think it's a problem. I might have to look into that and get back to you on that one. I know as far as wood chips, we don't recommend that, but I'm not sure about the leaves on those guys. But yeah, generally it's those thicker leaves, they just take so long to break down. So Japanese maple leaves are great. The other thing is leaves that are maybe in the roadway where maybe they have oil or gas or some sort of pollution or contaminants on them, maybe not trying to collect those. So collecting in your own yard or a park or something like that where there's not chemicals potentially on them too. This is a good thing to keep in mind.
Okay, if someone used the sheet mulching method in the fall, they would like to know, can they add a legume or grass crop on top of the sheet mulch?
Yeah, the one thing that, let's see, the one thing you might want to do is maybe do a thicker layer of something like soil or something on top of that cardboard, just so that it has something else to grow into a little bit. So if you were to do just cardboard or paper and then wood chips, there's not any soil for those roots to get into. So if you were to do cardboard or newspaper and then some soil and compost and then wood chips, that would have, you would have at least a couple inches for those roots to get into, to begin to grow. Once they start growing and that cardboard starts to break down, they'll be able to get through that. So I wouldn't worry about them not being able to get through as long as they have soil to begin that process.
Okay, is it important to leave some areas unmulched? For example, like, can a layer of mulch prevent ground bees from accessing their nests?
Yeah, and so I would definitely leave or think about leaving less, not putting it on so thick in some areas, or maybe doing leaves where it's something easier they can get underneath. It is important to think about all those different types of animals. And so, yeah, thinking about a space where maybe leaving it a little bit bare if it's under a tree where the rain isn't going to be completely compacting it. So choosing those spots where it might be protected from the rains, where you can leave a little bit of bare spots around. It is important to not put too much. You don't want to completely cover all of your soil, which is really, really thick layers of mulch, because that can hurt some of those different types of animals. So yes, keep being aware of that. If you've noticed some of those insects around, or some of those ground bees, kind of making sure maybe that spot you don't put quite so much on.
Okay, and the last mulch specific question. Do I need to spray weed killer or remove weeds before applying sheet mulch?
No, the one thing I would say, I mean, it does kind of depend on what type of weeds you have. We don't recommend any chemicals being sprayed because you can kill beneficial insects and also hurt some of the different types of organisms and bacteria and stuff that are actually good in your soil. So it's important, if you do have, say, something like dandelions where you have a really big taproot, removing some of the really big ones that you have. You're going to have some little bits that potentially are going to come up. But if you do at least 3 or 4 inches of mulch or a combination of dirt and mulch and compost on top of that cardboard, you should be pretty good and not have to worry about weeds coming through. Something like if you're trying to mulch over blackberries, for example, you're going to want to try and remove as much of that blackberry before you mulch. You wouldn't be able to just put it on top of a pile of blackberry and just expect it to be good. So something like that, just kind of looking at the types of weeds that you have. Most of the herbaceous or the perennial ones that are going to die back in the winter time are going to be great candidates for doing that sheet mulching on.
Okay, a couple questions about cover crops.
Mm-hmm.
Do you turn over the cover crop into the soil in the spring, or do you cut it down and compost the cuttings?
So you can do both. So oftentimes, depending on how much you have, you always want to cut it down in the spring. And I usually mention, let's see, it takes a little bit of time for it to break down. And so if you're planning on planting like a transplant or something into it, you want to give yourself about 3 weeks to a full month for the root systems to break down after you've cut it down. You can turn it over and actually take a fork or a shovel and dig under that root system and completely flip it on top of itself. That'll help quicken that process. It's not necessary because it will break down. You can also I oftentimes will cut all of the top part of the cover crop, cut it up into, like, I don't know, 3 to 4 inch pieces, and just lay it on top of the soil. And that will slowly break down. And whatever doesn't break down, you can just push aside and use as a mulch to go around the plants, because it will break down eventually. Sometimes with the different cereal grains, because they could be 3 or 4 feet tall by the time you cut them down, sometimes that can be too much. And so that you could compost and move away. Or you could, like I said, treat it like straw, and it could just be a new mulch that you put in, because it will eventually break down. Just the important thing is to make sure you're cutting it down before it goes to seed, because that's going to be the biggest problem that you're going to run into.
Okay, another person says, I pulled my pea plant at the end of its life, let it die out, and then churned it back into the soil.
Mhm.
It's sprouting new shoots. I'd plan to let it sit in there, maybe add a cover crop, and then turn it back into the bed this spring. Is that helpful to the bed, or should I pull it all back out?
With the peas, I wouldn't worry about it. The peas are going to be a good thing to continue to put in. If you had something in the Solanaceae family or the Brassica family. So Solanaceae is tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, potatoes. You want to pull all of those materials out of the bed because they can harbor disease such as late blight. And then brassicas, so kale, mustard, collards, broccoli, radishes, you want to remove those from the bed before you were to put something new in or do a cover crop, because they can cause a disease called clubroot to be in the soil. So those are the two families that is best to remove. Otherwise, you can do similar to what you were doing where you're chopping up those peas and putting them in, which is called chop and drop. So it's a different type of a technique to add a green manure, like a living matter, back into your soil. Yeah.
Are cover crops for large open areas, or can they be put in small empty flower beds? Would their roots interfere with other plants?
You can definitely put them in all sizes. I've done them in small 2 by 2 foot containers after doing that and doing them in there. So you can do any size. I do them in, like I said, 2 by 2 foot containers. I've done them in 4 by 8 veggie beds. I've seen them in full farms. So any size that works for you. As far as roots competing, I would say you would want to do, they can have pretty extensive root systems. So if you have a plant that might be kind of a delicate root system, you might not want to put them in that bed. And so that might be a good reason for you to then use something like leaves or burlap or mulch, like wood chips or something like that in that space instead. Generally, that's kind of the differentiating between using something like that versus if you were going to use a cover crop, is those root systems are meant to be able to go down and break up soil. So if you have a crop that you're worried about, or a plant that has more of a delicate root system, or that you don't want it to compete with too much, then I would stick with leaves or something else instead.
Okay, before I move on to the other questions, we wanted to ask if you could answer a few more questions just to help us determine the effectiveness of this workshop. So Selena, if you're able to put that second poll up.
Yeah.
And then for people that respond to that, again, we have prize drawings for some gardening books, or for a one-on-one consultation online with one of Tilth Alliance's gardening gurus. Okay, so next question. I have one about birds. How do you protect birds' nests that are in hanging baskets? One person had a bird's nest, and she says a blue jay came along and ate, or yeah, a blue jay came along and ate all 5 eggs.
Oh no.
I know.
I had a nest in my hanging basket this year. And so I lost half of my plants because I couldn't water them because Mama was mad at me every time I tried to water my plants. So to protect the nest from other birds, oh man. So blue jays, I mean, if it's a small bird that is going in there, that would be really hard to protect it. I would say you could try and put something around it, but you don't want to scare the mom away. You'd have to figure out another way to keep the blue jay away. Seattle Audubon Society might have some good recommendations on that. I don't have experience with specifically trying to keep blue jays out of a hanging basket. If it was some other type of area where it was like a whole tree or something like that, I think that would be a little bit easier. You could try and put some bird food in a different space and maybe get them to go somewhere else. That is one I would have to do some more research on. You stumped me on that one. But try the Audubon Society. They have some really good recommendations, and also different people that can help answer some of those questions too.
Question about bees. Do you know how to keep mason bees out of wood siding?
Give them more wood blocks to go into. So they're going to go to space. If you have wood blocks at your house, they have probably filled those up, or they're looking for a space to go. So we had wood blocks at my old house for the mason bees, and when they filled up the blocks, they went in all of the window sill trims, and they went into the holes in the screws for the patio furniture because we had ran out of space. So add more blocks in different parts of your yard and try and get them to go to those spaces, because those are going to be more ideal spaces for them than it is going to be in the siding. So yeah, other than that, I don't have a good answer besides puttying up, caulking up some of those holes. So yeah.
And now spiders. If someone has a lot of spiders in between their evergreens and in the plants in their rain garden, should they remove them?
I'm going to say no. Spiders are really good to actually have in your house in all different spaces. They're there because they're eating some of the different types of other bugs that are around. This time of year especially, they're going to be out in full-on force and probably be coming into your house too. Yeah, spiders are great to have around. They're also going to be good food for birds and other types of animals. And oftentimes they're in spaces where it is a little cooler or darker, or there is more bugs. So if it's in an evergreen, it might be that you might just need a little bit more air to get in and have a little bit more air circulation or more light to get into those areas. Might be a way to get them to kind of not be there quite so often, but they're going to be in those dark spots. So it's not going to hurt the tree at all.
Can you talk about specifically putting carpet roses and knockout roses to bed for the winter?
I mean, the big thing with roses is that you generally just do very minimal pruning this time of the year. You do most of your pruning in the springtime, like late winter, so like February-ish. Other than that, I would say pruning anything that's going to be kind of in the pathways or kind of getting into other plants, putting a little bit of mulch around the bottom of them. Other than that, I don't know more specific on that variety of rose to say, besides just the kind of general way that we tend to put that sort of stuff to bed.
With everything that you covered tonight, are there any major differences between if someone's just working with raised beds, the techniques you talked about? Is there anything they should know specifically about their raised beds?
I think the biggest thing is that, especially if there are raised beds that were for edibles and for vegetables, vegetables tend to suck so much nutrients out of the soil, and because a lot of them need very specific nutrients and types of soil, it's great to be able to just protect that soil and just kind of get it ready for next year. So that's kind of why it's important to get your soil tested, know where it's at, make a plan for rotating those crops, because like those two types of families that I mentioned of being harbors of different diseases, make sure you know where you're putting your plants every year and that you're moving those different families around so that you're disrupting different pests and diseases in your veggie beds. And then protecting that soil. So whether that's leaves, whether that's compost, whether that's burlap or straw, or just something to protect that soil for the next year is probably going to be one of your best bets for raised beds.
Do you have any suggestions for getting rid of buttercups?
So buttercups are known to like compacted acidic soil. So they're kind of one of those weeds that we call an indicator weed. So until you can fully get away and help to build that soil, so adding compost is a great way to build that soil and reduce compaction. You're going to have to dig out those root systems as much as possible, unfortunately, but doing that and then putting compost down, making sure you mulch or compost directly after removing will help with that. They are hard to get rid of unless you really do that. So in that area, if it's a really bad area, give them that area soil tested too, and seeing what your soil organic matter percentage is, what the acidity and pH levels are in your soil, and then what the macronutrient levels are, will help to make it, when you kind of amend it, you'll create a habitat where those don't want to live. So it could take a year or two to go through that process, but you will have less that you will have to fight every year if you start to amend that soil.
Do you have any tips for growing dill successfully?
I have had a very hard time with dill this year, mainly because the squirrels have dug into my pots every single time I planted them. Dill can be a little finicky. Starting it in the spring, it doesn't do super well this time of the year, I found. Starting in the spring, making sure that it's getting enough moisture and heat and not drying out. Their roots don't like to be moved around too much. So being delicate with the root system. So if you're going to do it in a pot, really try not to disrupt those roots when you transplant it. If you're going to direct sow it, just direct sow it, cover it, let it just kind of hang out for a little while. Yeah, I tried dill multiple times. The dang squirrels came after them every time. So
We've got a few more minutes left, so I'm going to go through the questions that are remaining in the chat box. What is a great natural alternative to keep weeds off of pavers and pebble borders?
Scrubbing them. So a lot of times we don't like to recommend any sort of chemical use for anything. Weeds can be very difficult. I mean, you can do solarization with some of the stuff depending on what the area looks like. So that's just putting a tarp or something over it to kill any sort of the weed seeds. Recognizing that it's harder to weed, like actually fully manually pull weeds out of some of those spaces. Boiling water can help with some soap. You can also, as kind of a last resort, do some vinegar type stuff. Just be very, very careful because it is still a chemical, even though it's a natural chemical. It is one that can work in areas where you're not doing it in a soil bed, because they can kill beneficial insects and different microorganisms. It can also burn your eyes, so be very careful when you are doing that. Even though, like I said, it's still a natural kind of type of thing, it is still a chemical. So the only time we ever recommend that is going to be in gravel or in like cement sidewalks where you're not going to be hurting any types of bugs. But the hottest time of the year, pulling out any sort of big weeds that are like dandelions, because no chemicals or anything's going to do anything with that. So you got to get out that root system as much as possible.
How do you decide which perennials need to be mulched, and when in the fall should you do this?
I would say, I'm trying to think if there's anything that I wouldn't mulch. I think almost all perennials can be mulched, I would say. And I would say it's a good time to do it in the fall before the rains start. Mainly because, and also when you can still see them. So if they're going to be deciduous perennials that are going to die back, doing it before they actually go down so you can see where the crowns are. You don't want to cover up the crowns of anything because it can help, they can rot out. So for example, like different ferns you definitely want to be careful about because they can rot out their crown very easily. So making sure you're doing it before they fully die back so you can see what the plants are. And then also just before the rains come, because nobody likes to be out there mulching in the rain anyways.
Do you have any recommendations for where to get cover crop?
So cover crop seed is starting to go out kind of like toilet paper earlier in the year. So I would try and look, any of the plant nurseries generally will have some. A lot of times they will be a mixture of rye and vetch or rye and clover. Or oats. They'll have combos a lot of times, which is great. It's okay to mix them. You don't have to have just one. A lot of different online seed stores sell them. And so I would probably recommend doing that just because a lot of the nurseries are running out of it really quickly. So go online and you want to just put it down, just kind of, not a super thick layer, but just kind of as if you were throwing chicken scratch is a good way to kind of think about it. You're just kind of spreading it out onto your bed, and you just pretty much just have to pat it down, maybe putting a little bit of leaves or something on top just so the birds don't eat all of it. But yeah, it's a great way to just kind of put something else in the bed.
Okay, and then there was one question in here asking about some pruning resources, but I have a feeling we will probably get more into pruning at next week's fall yard maintenance workshop. So
yes, I will go into some basics of pruning, and I'm also going to create a resource sheet that goes into more depth of pruning. But there's a lot of good resources that I have at the end of next week's on different pruning resources too.
okay, I think that is all that we have tonight. Thank you so much, Selena. Yeah, thank you everyone for giving up your evening and spending it with us. We really appreciate it. And like I said, I will email everyone that attended tonight by noon on Friday. So I'll update the resource page with any other websites that Selena may have mentioned during her presentation that aren't already on the page. We'll be sure that we get those all added. And we hope that we see most of you again next week too. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Did you get all the poll results?
I have them all, yes. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much.
Okay. All right, I'm going to stop recording now.
Okay. All right.